Hi, this video is Visual Journals Experimenting with Media. In this video, we're going to go through a series of different types of media that hopefully you've had at least a little experience with over your high school and middle school careers as kind of review and preparation for your visual journals. So your visual journal learning guide should look a little something like this, and it's going to walk you through steps. Please follow them in order, and it says here for steps 1 through 10, watch the video, Visual Journals Experimenting with Media, which is what we're doing. The nice thing about having this as a video is that you could fast forward, you could stop, you could pause, you could rewind and rewatch. So you have this available to you either in a QR code, which is probably somewhere off to the side. It's also available on my website if you need to see it again at any point over the course of the school year. Yours will be back to back. So this is going to be the back of your first page, or your page number 2. And this is one page that you should have already looked at, and hopefully you've started to determine what is a sketchbook, what is a visual journal, are there similarities, are there differences. Please make sure that you've completed this with 3 things in each section, and have a conversation with your peers about it to see what it is that you guys are thinking, and then put it down on paper so that I can see what you're thinking as well. We're going to start out today with watercolor, and you can tell that this paper that the watercolor practice is printed on is much thicker. It's actually printed on watercolor paper. You can also see that the wet on dry is the first thing that I want you to do. So once you have all your materials gathered, I'm going to have you go ahead and start painting in some sort of a shape in the wet on dry section so that it can go ahead and dry before we get to that point. So speaking of materials, what are you going to need in order to do this page, to complete it? You're going to need a couple different paintbrushes. I'm trying out these new ones. I like flat brushes, so I grabbed a couple different flat brushes in different sizes, and then I wanted something a little smaller in case I was interested in doing some detail. You're going to need a palette, you're going to need a cup with water, a paper towel, and then there's going to be a couple different types of resist that we're going to do here as well. So you're going to need a light, preferably white colored crayon, you may have to share, and then some masking tape. So I've already done my wet on dry. Hopefully you're completing that as well. And I'm going to go ahead and work on my flat wash. I like to use a large flat brush in order to get a successful flat wash. When you're doing a flat wash, your goal is to have it be nice and flat and even with your color. Another thing to keep in mind is that it's very nice to mix colors from your watercolor palette. When you use them straight out of the container, they look very primary school, like a little kid did it. So now is a good opportunity for you to practice playing around with your colors, mixing colors, and starting to remember some of that color theory that you may have done in earlier art classes. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up this kind of like a red-violet here. When you mix it up, you want to make sure you have enough to cover the entire square. If you want it to be lighter in value, you need to make sure that you add more water to it. This will give you more paint as well, but it will also lighten the value of your color. So I've got a pretty good amount mixed up here, and I'm ready to start with my flat wash. So I'm going to start at the top and pull a bead of color across. I'm also kind of tilting my paper so that the majority of my color, my pigment, runs towards the bottom. And I'm going to slightly overlap that with my next one so that it kind of pulls that extra paint or pigment that I have there to the bottom as well. And remember, your goal here is to get it to be nice and flat and even. You don't want to be able to see those streaks in between. If at the bottom you're left with this like puddle of color, wash and dry out your brush, and you can kind of soak that color up with your brush there. So you should get a nice, flat, even wash. Next, I'm going to work on graded wash. I'm going to go ahead and pick a different hue for that. I'm going to do kind of this yellow here. Again, I'm going to pull it off to the side. Oh, I still have some purple in my paintbrush, so it's actually giving me this kind of neutral color. I'm going to add a bit of green to that. Come up with an interesting color here. All right, so for your graded wash, you're going to want to start with your hue at the top. Once again, kind of tilt your paper. I would like that to have a little bit deeper of a color to it. And rather than dipping my paintbrush back into my color now, I'm actually going to dip it into the water as I continue to pull that color down so that my wash becomes lighter and lighter and lighter in value. One way you could use this in your sketchbook would be, it doesn't have to go from dark to light. It could also go from dark to light. It depends on what direction you paint it. So you could flip your sketchbook upside down, do the same thing, and wind up with the opposite, with a lighter at the top of your page and a darker at the bottom. Wet and wet is really fun. You could start with just clear water on your paper and start to just go in and add colors that are going to bleed together. Play around with, what happens when I use different brushes. So you could use thicker brushes, you could use some thinner brushes. How can you pull colors into each other to force them to blend together? Wet and dry. Hopefully, if your color is dry already, which mine is dry to the touch, you can then go in with another color on top without ruining the hard edge of the original shape. So this is really good for translucent layers if you want to stay true to the original edge that you've created. You can go ahead and you have to be patient with wet on dry, but if you do let that first one dry, it will be successful. You'll continue to have the hard edge of the original shape. Blending, similar to flat wash and graded wash in that we are going to start with a color at the top. And we're going to have it blend into another color at the bottom. So pick colors that would blend nicely with each other. Maybe don't choose complements, choose colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this kind of red-orange that I've mixed up. Again, I'm kind of tilting my paper so that that bead of color is kind of towards the bottom of my, my painting stroke. I'm going to do just a little bit further, so I'm about halfway in my square, and then I'm going to pull up some of my second color that I want to blend together, and I'm going to overlap that last bead there and let those colors all blend together. I'm going to pull more of that color and to complete my square. Again, if you have extra paint, like a pool of paint there, dry out your brush and you can kind of soak that up. Get that all up there. There we go. Masking tape resist. You could take a piece of masking tape, you could cut it into shapes, or in my case, for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to go ahead and tear a couple small pieces. You could put these in a design if you wanted to. And from there, we're going to go ahead and paint over that. You can do any of the techniques that we've already practiced on top. Once that's dry, we'll come back, remove the masking tape, and you will have white areas wherever the masking tape was. Crayon resist. This is really fun, especially for little kids. So go ahead and draw some kind of picture with the white crayon or your light colored crayon. And when you paint over it, you will then reveal whatever it was that you had drawn originally. This is really good for things like highlights in different areas. For dry brush, we're going to dry out your paintbrush. Get it as dry as you can. One way I like to do it is almost just like lay half of my paintbrush into my paint. And then you're going to flip your paintbrush over so the paint is on the side that's facing up. And you can play around with getting some different strokes here. This is also another one that's really good for experimenting with different paintbrushes to see different types of effects that you might be able to get. And last but not least, play around with splatter. You need a lot of water in your paintbrush for splatter. Be careful of your neighbor. And you're going to almost throw the paint at your paper. You could also play around with tapping. What does tapping do? Do you get different types of splatters when you do different techniques. So that is your watercolor practice. If you want to tear this out of your learning guide, you're more than welcome to. Make sure you put your name across the top before you go ahead and place that onto the drying rack. Next, we'll be moving on to acrylic paint, which in your learning guide should be step number 3. So you're gonna need a palette with a couple different colors of paint. You're going to need a cup with water, a paper towel, and once again, a variety of different paintbrushes. Our first practice, we're going to work on blending white into a hue. Once again, I really like to use large flat paintbrushes for blending large areas. So I'm going to go ahead and start with placing a good amount of white down in this area. And I'm going to bring that about halfway. It doesn't have to be perfectly pretty within the lines. This is meant to be practice, so feel free to kind of loosen up a little bit. I'm then going to clean out my paintbrush and dry it on my paper towel. And I'm going to grab a hue. I'm going to go with blue here. And I'm going to start to I'm going to start on the opposite end and start to bring that blue into the white. With acrylic paint, you have to work kind of quick because it does want to dry. And your goal here is to try to get rid of any hard edge. So you have to work it back and forth. Once again, I'm going to clean out my paintbrush, dry it off. And I think that using a vertical brush movement in order to get this to be blended will help you out a lot. So don't be afraid to spend a little bit of time with this and try to get it to be as nicely blended as possible and spend some time kind of working it back and forth. If you need to get more of one of the colors into your paintbrush and kind of start over, do another layer, that's okay too. Do keep in mind you're doing this on watercolor paper. Watercolor paper doesn't always stand up the best with acrylic paint. So you may get some buckling of your paper. With our primary into a secondary, I'm going to go ahead and do, I would pick neighboring colors rather than complementary. So I'm going to use blue again. And I'm going to blend it into my green. Using the same technique that I just used above, I'm going to bring my green about halfway, have them meet each other, and then start to pull my green into the blue, kind of move it back and forth there until you get it to be nice and well blended. I could spend some more time with that, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. With textures, acrylic paint you can create a lot of different texture with acrylic paint. So spend some time seeing how many different textures can you make. Can you make physical, actual, textured, real bumps? When this dries, it will dry as a thick bump like that. What happens if I start to, mix other colors in as well? Think about back to the watercolor with the dry brush. Can you practice dry brush with the acrylic paint as well? So start to play around, see how many different types of textures and brush strokes you can create with the acrylic paint. Once again, you can pull this out of your learning guide. Make sure you write your name across the top so that we know who it belongs to. And that completes the painting portion of your visual journal practice. Next, we're going to go ahead and work with some pen and ink, which hopefully is also a review from Art 2 for many of you. So you're going to need an inkwell as well as a pen and nib. Remember, with your pen nib, it's got a line down the middle, and when you put gentle pressure on the end point of that nib, it separates. You want the ink to go into that little hole and then slowly flow down that center piece to the point. You don't want to put too much pressure on your pen nib because you will break it. If you have a broken pen nib, please let me know and I can help you replace that. So we're gonna go ahead and start with contour lines. Use these boxes however you see fit. You do not have to feel like you are stuck with a certain thing within each one. Contour lines track the contour or the shape of an object. So if I start to draw in, let's say, a cylinder, I'm going to want to show the contour or the curve of that cylinder as I work my way down. And maybe I want to complete that with the sides there. So I'm showing the curve or the shape of an object. With wavy lines, think of like a wood grain and have fun with how you might be able to have these lines kind of echo each other. It could also be maybe it's puddles or ripples in a pond. So you can go ahead and play with some different types of wavy lines. Crisscross lines are typically, think like hair. They crisscross each other, but they're not in regular intervals. They're more random than something like cross-hatching. So you could draw a little animal here. You could draw a person with some hair. Go ahead and play with crisscross lines. Scribble lines can be a neat way to provide texture and value as well. You can make very loose scribbled lines and have it be kind of lighter in value, but you could create lots of scribble lines that are really close to each other and layered in order to create a darker value as well. Stippling is going to be dots. Again, the more dots that you put closer together, the darker value that you're going to create as an illusion for your viewer. And when you have fewer dots further apart, it's going to create the illusion of a much lighter value. Cross-hatching is more regular intervals of hatching. And again, when lines are further apart and there aren't very many overlapping, you get a much lighter value. And when you have more lines stacked on top of each other, going lots of different directions, you create darker values. And then we have parallel lines. These are lines that won't show any form or three-dimensional qualities like contour lines would. They all kind of echo each other. This might be good for things like drawing in a shadow. So you can play with, or just filling in an area with some sort of value. Another way to think of parallel lines is that when you have lines further apart, again, that value is going to be very light, but when you start to put lots of smaller lines closer together, you're going to get a much darker value. So you could also use parallel lines as a way to create value with something. On the back of page number 6, which was step number 4, you should have step number 5. You may want to let this dry a minute before you move on to step number 5. For step number 5, you're going to be working with collage, and the important thing here is that you're thinking about foreground, middle ground, and background. So go ahead and grab some magazines, and if you'd like an X-Acto knife and a board, I'd be happy to grab that for you as well. If you're more comfortable using scissors, by all means, go ahead and use scissors. So background, I thought about my background first. I found this great picture, I loved the color, and I want to make something new. So I found another picture of a house, and I thought, wouldn't that sky be a great background for this house? And so I decided I'm going to put that on top. And then collage is a great way to use crazy things that you find and create a new story. So I found this little pink poodle, and I decided I was going to put him in here. I cut out very carefully along the edge of my poodle, and even when you cut out things like the tiny little triangle in between the poodle's front legs, that helps with the illusion of meshing all of these different images together to create one new image. And then I have this guy, I'm going to make him like he's fishing for this poodle maybe. And this is a good example of where if I had cut out really close to along the fishing pole, yes, it would be extremely delicate, but it would also be totally worth it, because right now I have this different background which ruins the illusion of my collage coming together. to create a convincing, strange image. When you have your image all together, please make sure you use at least 5 different things within your collage. It doesn't have to be real big. It doesn't have to be super detailed. If you really get into it, by all means, go for it. Take a glue stick, glue it all down onto this page so that I can see what you've done. Page 8, we're going to be working with oil pastel. First thing that I'm going to have you do is just kind of play around and see what different kinds of line marks you can make. Can you make thick lines? Can you make thin lines? How do you get all these different types of lines? Can you take the full side of one pastel and fill in a really large area quickly? And just kind of play to see what kinds of things that you can do. Can you do cross hatching? Let's see here. You know what happens when I cross hatch with red going one direction and blue going another direction? Am I going to start to get the illusion of purple if I stand back? Here I'm going to mix a lighter color using white on top of another color. So I'm going to go ahead and start with some blue. I'm going to add some white. So not only did it make my blue lighter, but it also seemed to make it smoother as it blended it together. So that's something to keep in mind if you decide that you want to work with oil pastels. Here I'm going to mix a darker color using the color on top of black. My suggestion is not to get really, don't push very hard with your black to begin with. You won't be able to add any hue on top of it. Here we have kind of a dark purple now. Mix the secondary by blending 2 primary colors together. I'm going to go ahead and use this yellow I've already got going on in this square. Add a little bit of red. Because red's darker, I'm not going to add it in as thick, and maybe I'll come back in with my yellow in order to make that an orange. Mix an intermediate color by blending a primary and secondary next to each other on the color wheel. Again, I could use my yellow. I can add some orange to that. Add some more yellow on top in order to get kind of a yellow-orange. And then make a range of 3 different grays. So play around. What happens if I put black on top of white? What happens if I add a little bit more pressure? What if I add white on top of black? Which ways do you feel like you have more control with the oil pastel? Step number 7, you're going to learn and review techniques for working with charcoal and chalk pastel. In this case, you're probably going to wind up using more so the chalk pastel rather than the charcoal, but a lot of the techniques are similar for both, but the chalk pastel will have pigment to it, whereas the charcoal will just be strictly value. So again, you're going to be doing a lot of the same things that you just did with the oil pastel. Play around with how can I get some different kinds of marks? How can I fill areas quickly? Do I get a lot of detail? Just get a sense for what it's like to work with the chalk pastels. You're going to go ahead and mix a lighter color using white on top of another color. Mix a darker color using the color on top of black. Again, don't push really, really hard before you go ahead and add that color on top. Maybe just add it very lightly. Mix a secondary color by blending 2 primary colors together. Mix an intermediate color by blending a primary and a secondary next to each other on the color wheel, and then make a range of 3 different grays. For step number 8, we're going to go ahead and play around with some simple ways of printmaking. This is styrofoam from a styrofoam tray that held some vegetables that I purchased. If you have these at home, please bring them in. I will give you extra credit. They're great for printmaking. I don't want the ones that had meat on them because that's just gross. So I'm going to go ahead and take the styrofoam and just a simple pencil. It's not terribly sharp, and you can go ahead and draw a design in, putting pressure into the styrofoam so that you get an indented mark. And you could go ahead and use the printmaking, the brayer, and the printmaking ink if you would like to. You could also just use acrylic paint and paint that on top. If printmaking is something that you really like and want to use in your visual journal, you can let me know. I do have extra pieces of linoleum available if you want to you do some linoleum printing. Put that down. And it should work. Very similar to a stamp. I think I had too much paint on it there. Let's see. So you can get some different textures that way. Something worth playing around with for sure, is especially if you wanted something repeated multiple times. For stencil, I have some very thin cardboard. You can cut out a very simple stencil. Again, you could take marker and trace the inside. You could also use paint in order to create a stencil that way. You could also use the positive and create a negative by painting around it. So these are some fun things that you could also be doing in your visual journal, or playing around with in your visual journal. For step 9, review working with some colored pencils. So go ahead and layer colors in order to create a tint. Remember, when we're working with colored pencils, light layers are the best way to work with them. So I'm going to lightly put in some purple here. I'm going to add some white on top. And you want it to feel burnished and solid. So add a little bit of pressure to it as you're working with those colored pencils there. To create a shade, I'm going to do the similar idea, but with some black here. With black, you have to be a little bit more gentle. You don't want it to overpower your color. So I'm not going to put as much pressure. And I might also have to do some more layering in order to make sure I keep my hue visible. And then you're going to layer colors to create an intermediate. So let's do, I have blue and green here. So I'm going to start out with a layer of blue. Add some green. And I'm going to again have to kind of layer in order to get it to be nice and solid and burnished, and also so that it is the true intermediate. I want to be able to see blue and green, and I don't want one overpowering the other. These are also watercolor pencils. Most of them are. They will say watercolor pencil on them. And so don't forget that you can also then take some water in a paintbrush and blend them in order to get a watercolor effect. So that's something else that you could play with. For step number 10, I want you to figure out what media works well together. Are there things that just don't go together, that you shouldn't put together for some reason? So this is a place for you to experiment and play around with as maybe you're waiting for your peers to kind of catch up with you, or if you just have some questions and some things that you want to figure out. This is a good place for you to go ahead and do those experimentations. We're going to go through the rest of the steps together. As a group. I hope that you were able to get some good ideas and some kind of refreshment on some different types of media and techniques from this exercise. And I hope you guys have a great year with your visual journals.